spooky place.
Imagine your little brother's imaginary friend knows your family's darkest secrets, things no one else could possibly know. What starts as innocent childhood fun turns into a terrifying descent into betrayal, ancient rituals, and an unimaginable curse. This isn't just a story about an imaginary friend. It's about the nightmare that friend brought to life. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The final step. When I was 10 years old and Kyle was just 4, something strange began to happen. At first, it seemed like a normal part of growing up. Children often have imaginary friends. But what began as innocent, playful behavior quickly escalated into something far darker. Kyle's imaginary friend was named Bosco. He was short, pudgy, and always wore an old, tattered gray coat with a thick gray beard. At first, my parents thought it was just a quirky childhood phase, but they couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that something about Bosco was different. They shrugged it off when Kyle insisted Bosco needed his own seat at the table, or that he had to make room in front of the mirror for his imaginary friend's beard grooming. But as days passed, the stories Kyle shared about Bosco began to become more unsettling. Kyle described Bosco as if he were a real person, with vivid details that even adults couldn't have come up with. One night, after a particularly odd dinner where Bosco had insisted on using a different fork, Kyle whispered to me with a sense of urgency, "Bosco says he's going to keep me safe. He doesn't like Mom's new friend." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a child's exaggerated imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Bosco wasn't just some figment of Kyle's mind. There was something alive about him. And soon, I realized I wasn't the only one who felt that way. The incident. One day, while we were waiting for Mom to pick us up from school, Kyle suddenly tugged at my arm, his eyes wide with panic. "I need to go to the store," he insisted. I told him we could wait for Mom, but he was relentless. His grip on my arm tightened, and his face contorted in desperation. "I need a candy bar. Now." Reluctantly, I agreed, and we crossed the street. As we neared the store, I heard the screech of tires, then a sickening crash. I turned around just in time to see the bus careen out of control, plowing into the crowd at the bus stop. People screamed, blood splattering on the pavement. I froze in shock, but Kyle was hysterical, crying uncontrollably. When Mom arrived, she scooped us into her arms, shaking with fear. As we huddled in the car, she asked me why we had crossed the street. I told her about the candy bar, and she turned to Kyle. He looked up with wide eyes and said, "I didn't want the candy bar. Bosco did. Bosco told me to go." My heart skipped a beat. We were supposed to be dead. The fact that Kyle, of all people, had been the one to make us move was terrifying. And the fact that Bosco had known something would happen before it happened was enough to rattle me to my core. The shocking truth. For weeks, life carried on, but then something happened that none of us could have predicted. My mom's sister, Aunt Rita, moved to town. She was beautiful, kind-hearted, and seemed to be the perfect addition to the family. At least, that's what I thought at first. One weekend, we visited our grandparents, leaving Dad home alone. Aunt Rita had recently started working with him at his company, but Mom seemed strangely distant about it. It wasn't until the evening when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Kyle was fiddling with the TV remote when he accidentally landed on a scene from the movie Ghost. The infamous pottery scene played, and my mom quickly grabbed the remote, switching to a kids channel. But Kyle wasn't having it. He pouted and demanded, "Why can't I watch? Why is it okay for Dad and Aunt Rita to hug like that?" Mom froze. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Kyle, looking confused, repeated, "Dad and Aunt Rita hug like that when we're at school. They get naked in Kyle's bed and do it. Bosco told me. Bosco said they do it every week." A cold chill swept through the room. My mom's face went ashen. She stood up abruptly and told our grandparents we were leaving. I remember the tense silence as we drove home, but that silence was nothing compared to what would happen next. At home, Kyle insisted that Bosco was with us, standing in the corner of the living room, watching us. Bosco says he's keeping an eye on Aunt Rita, Kyle said, his voice low and serious. That night, we stayed at our grandparents' house, but when we returned to our home the next day, things had changed. Mom came back with bags, saying we'd be staying with Nana and Papa for a while. My heart sank when I saw the look on her face. Something was terribly wrong. The final twist. Days passed, and my parents' divorce was finalized. But that wasn't the end of it. Every night, I'd hear strange noises coming from the hallway. Footsteps, whispering voices, like someone was watching me. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, until one night, I saw him, Bosco, standing in the hallway, staring at me with his empty eyes. His thick, gray beard was twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have looked," he whispered. I screamed and ran to my mom, but when we searched the house, there was no sign of him. But I knew the truth now. Bosco wasn't just an imaginary friend. He was something much worse, something that had been lurking in the shadows of our family, manipulating events, pulling strings. It wasn't until years later that I discovered the full story. Kyle's imaginary friend, Bosco, wasn't a creation of his mind at all. He was a presence, an entity that had attached itself to our family long before Kyle was born. A spirit that fed on fear, manipulating the weak, and using our darkest secrets against us. My father's affair with Aunt Rita was just a part of the twisted game Bosco was playing. He had been feeding off the dysfunction, and when it was over, he would move on to his next victim. The scariest part? He never really left. After the divorce, life seemed to stabilize, or at least it appeared that way. But things began to get even stranger in the months that followed. Kyle would often sit by the window, staring into the empty night with a look of deep concentration. I asked him once what he was doing, and his response made my blood run cold. "I'm waiting for Bosco." One evening, I returned home late after a friend's sleepover, exhausted and eager to crawl into bed. The house was silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. But as I passed the living room, I saw Kyle sitting upright on the couch. The lights were off, but he was smiling to himself, his eyes locked on something in the corner of the room. I approached him quietly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Kyle," I whispered, "who are you talking to?" He turned to me, his eyes wide and unnaturally calm. "Bosco is here. He's waiting for you to see him too." My stomach twisted into a knot. I dismissed Bosco as a product of Kyle's imagination for so long, but something felt off. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. Suddenly, I heard a creak from the hallway, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. "Mom?" I called out, but she wasn't home. And then I heard it again, a whisper, this time much louder. "Come and see." I froze, unable to move as a shadow slowly took shape in the hallway. It was Bosco, but this time, he wasn't just an illusion. He was solid real, standing just beyond the doorframe, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I felt the chill of his presence seeping into my skin. Then, in a voice that sounded almost too familiar, Bosco spoke again. "You've always known the truth. You just didn't want to see it." Before I could react, the lights flickered violently, and the shadow disappeared, leaving me in pitch darkness. When Mom returned home, I immediately told her what had happened, but she dismissed it as a product of exhaustion. "You're just imagining things, sweetheart," she said. "There's nothing to be afraid of." But I wasn't sure anymore, and neither was Kyle. He began speaking less about Bosco, but when he did, His words were always the same. He's still watching. Years passed, and the remnants of Bosco's influence slowly faded from my family's lives, or so we thought. But then, on the eve of Kyle's 16th birthday, we were visited by someone unexpected, a man in a dark suit, with eyes like black voids that seemed to pierce through everything. He introduced himself as Mr. Fane, and claimed to be from a special organization that had been investigating paranormal occurrences. The moment he spoke, I felt a chill down my spine. "I've been watching your family for a long time," he said cryptically. "You may not realize it, but your family's connection to the entity known as Bosco is not a coincidence. It was chosen." I recoiled, not understanding. But Mr. Fane continued, unfazed by my confusion. "You see," he said, "the thing you call Bosco is not simply an imaginary friend. It is an ancient spirit, a malevolent force that feeds off emotional turmoil, secrets, and guilt. Your father's affair with your aunt, the divorce, Kyle's connection, it was all planned. Bosco had a purpose, and you have unwittingly become part of a much darker game." My head spun with disbelief, but Mr. Fane wasn't finished. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old, yellowed contract. It had my father's signature at the bottom. It was a pact, a binding contract made years ago, under the guise of something innocent, an agreement made in exchange for success, power, and protection. But the price for those things was far worse than any of us could have imagined. Your father didn't just cheat on your mother. He sold your family's soul to the entity you call Bosco, Mr. Fane explained. And Bosco, in turn, has been using you all as pawns in his sick, twisted game. He can't leave until the contract is fulfilled. I stood there, frozen in shock as the truth hit me like a wave. The secrets of our family's dark past had been hidden from us for so long, but now, it was all crashing down. Bosco, the imaginary friend, was not just a figment of our minds. He was a manifestation of something far more evil, an ancient force that had been feeding off our pain, manipulating us from the shadows. But then, just when I thought the story couldn't get any worse, Kyle stepped forward, his face eerily calm. He looked up at Mr. Fane and smiled, a smile that sent a wave of terror coursing through me. "You're too late," Kyle said. "Bosco already told me everything. He doesn't want anything from us anymore." Mr. Fane's expression faltered for the briefest moment. "What do you mean?" Kyle's voice lowered to a whisper. "He's already taken what he wanted, and now we belong to him." After Kyle's chilling revelation about Bosco's true intentions, everything began to spiral out of control. Mr. Fane, the mysterious man who had appeared with his dire warnings, vanished as quickly as he came, leaving us with more questions than answers. But the weight of his words lingered, haunting us. We belonged to Bosco now. The truth was more horrifying than we could have imagined. My father, driven by greed and desperation, had sold our souls to this ancient entity, and it wasn't just a one-time deal. It was a binding contract that could only be broken by sacrifice. As weeks passed, I tried to forget Mr. Fane's words, hoping that it was just some sick joke. But every night, I could feel something watching me from the shadows. And Kyle wasn't the same. He began acting strange, his eyes hollow, as if he wasn't fully there. One night, I woke up to find Kyle standing by my bed, whispering something I couldn't quite hear. He looked different, distant, almost like he was in a trance. I shook him awake, but instead of reacting like a normal person, he just stood there, staring at me with that same eerie smile. "Bosco says it's time," he murmured. "Time for the final step." I froze, my heart pounding. What final step? The return of the father. The next day, things took an even darker turn. My dad showed up at our house unannounced, something he hadn't done in years. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. He looked older, broken, like someone who had been through a terrible ordeal. "Where is Kyle?" he demanded, his voice shaky. "I need to speak with him." I told him that Kyle was upstairs, but something in my gut told me not to let him near my brother. I had spent years hating my father for the pain he had caused, but now I feared for him. He seemed like a man on the edge, as if the very air around him was suffocating him. Dad insisted that we go into the living room to talk. He locked the door behind us, his face tight with anxiety. "You don't understand," he said. "I thought I could escape it, but I can't. Bosco, he's always been with me. He's been using me from the start." My breath caught in my throat. "What are you talking about?" Dad looked away, his eyes filled with guilt. "When I made the pact with Bosco all those years ago, I thought it was just for success, for wealth. But it was never about that. Bosco wanted power. He wanted control over all of us. And I gave him that power." I stepped back horrified. "You sold us?" Dad's eyes were full of regret. I didn't know how far it would go. I thought I could control it, but Bosco has been feeding on our fears, our pain, our guilt. He's been manipulating us from the inside, and now we're too far gone. It's too late. Just as I opened my mouth to respond, there was a loud bang at the door. The handle rattled violently as if someone or something was trying to break in. My father's face turned white as he whispered, "It's him. He's come for us." The dark ritual. The door swung open with a deafening creak, and there stood a figure cloaked in shadows. It wasn't Bosco, but it was something worse. The thing standing in the doorway looked like a man, but its features were twisted and disfigured, as if it had been shaped by some malevolent force. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural red light. "You thought you could escape?" the figure hissed. "You made a deal with me, and now it's time to pay. The blood debt is due." I screamed for Kyle, but when I turned around, my brother was no longer in the room. The house was completely still, too still. I rushed upstairs, my heart racing, and found Kyle in his bedroom. He was standing by the window, gazing out into the night with a vacant expression. "Bosco wants to finish what he started," Kyle said, his voice low and monotone. "The ritual is nearly complete." I tried to shake him, to bring him back to reality, but it was as if he were trapped in a dream. His eyes were empty, and his body felt cold. The room seemed to grow darker, the air thick with an oppressive energy. Suddenly, the walls seemed to pulse with a dark rhythm, as if the house itself was alive. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, moving toward us. The temperature dropped dramatically, and I could see my breath in the air. And then I heard it, a low, rumbling voice from the darkness. "Time to end the game." The shadows closed in, and everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the cold floor of Kyle's room. My body ached, and my head felt like it was spinning. I tried to sit up, but everything around me felt wrong. The room was silent, too silent. I looked over at Kyle, and my heart skipped a beat. He was standing in the center of the room, his eyes glowing with a sickening red light. His body seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy, and in his hands, he held a blackened, ancient book. The pages of the book were stained with something dark, something alive. "Bosco is inside me now," Kyle said, his voice not quite his own. It was deeper, more sinister. "I am the vessel. I am the one who will bring him fully into this world." I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. This wasn't my brother anymore. The figure in front of me wasn't Kyle. It was something else, something much older, much darker. "Everything you've done, everything you've suffered, it was all for this moment," the creature said, its voice a combination of Kyle's and something far more ancient, more terrible. Suddenly, I heard a pounding noise from downstairs. It was my father. He was shouting something, but his voice was distorted, warped, as if it were being twisted by some unnatural force. The room around me began to shake violently, and the walls cracked. The air thickened, heavy with dark energy. I felt the ground beneath me give way as the very foundation of the house seemed to collapse, as if the house itself was being torn apart by the forces Kyle, no, Bosco, was summoning. The final act of the ritual was about to be complete. The walls groaned under the strain of the unnatural forces consuming the house. Kyle, or whatever he had become, stood in the center of the room, the ancient book clutched in his hands. The air was thick with dark energy, swirling like a storm inside the walls, as though the house itself were alive and eager to tear itself apart. The floor was cracked, the lights flickering violently, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. I stumbled to my feet, desperate to stop whatever horrible ritual was unfolding before me. My mind raced, but all I could think was that this unholy ceremony was the moment when everything would either end or break wide open. "Kyle," I screamed, my voice hoarse. "Please, it's me. You have to fight it. You have to fight him." Kyle's head snapped toward me. His eyes were no longer his own. They were dark, fathomless, glowing with an unnatural light, like a bottomless abyss. A cold, unsettling smile spread across his face, and he spoke in a voice that was not his own, but Bosco's. "You think you can stop him? You're too late," the creature hissed. "This is how it was always meant to be. Your family has been feeding him for years. Every betrayal, every tear, every broken piece of your lives, all for this." I stumbled backward, as though the words were a physical force pushing me away. The shadows in the room seemed to grow thicker, twisting and contorting, reaching for me. The temperature plummeted, and I could hear the whispers of voices, ancient, forgotten, calling to me from the depths of darkness. "You're part of the game now," Bosco's voice said, the words slithering through the air like poison. "And the game is nearly over." Suddenly, the book in Kyle's hands burst open with a deafening crack. The pages turned rapidly, the words on them glowing with an eerie, red light. As if pulled by an unseen force, Kyle's body jerked unnaturally, his arms stretching outward, as though he were being torn apart by the ritual itself. A deep, guttural cry escaped his throat, but it wasn't a sound I recognized. I realized with horror that Kyle was no longer just a vessel for Bosco. He had become the portal, the bridge between the living world and the darkness beyond. In that moment, my mind flashed to the one thing that Mr. Fane had told us. The only way to break the pact was through sacrifice. But the thought of losing my brother, I couldn't bear it. But then, a terrifying realization hit me. What if the sacrifice wasn't just Kyle? What if it was me? The walls groaned under the strain of the unnatural forces consuming the house. Kyle, or whatever he had become, stood in the center of the room, the ancient book clutched in his hands. The air was thick with dark energy, swirling like a storm inside the walls, as though the house itself were alive and eager to tear itself apart. The floor was cracked, the lights flickering violently, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. I stumbled to my feet, desperate to stop whatever horrible ritual was unfolding before me. My mind raced, but all I could think was that this unholy ceremony was the moment when everything would either end or break wide open. "Kyle," I screamed, my voice hoarse. "Please, it's me. You have to fight it. You have to fight him." Kyle's head snapped toward me. His eyes were no longer his own. They were dark, fathomless, glowing with an unnatural light, like a bottomless abyss. A cold, unsettling smile spread across his face, and he spoke in a voice that was not his own, but Bosco's. "You think you can stop him? You're too late," the creature hissed. "This is how it was always meant to be. Your family has been feeding him for years. Every betrayal, every tear, every broken piece of your lives, all for this." I stumbled backward, as though the words were a physical force pushing me away. The shadows in the room seemed to grow thicker, twisting and contorting, reaching for me. The temperature plummeted, and I could hear the whispers of voices, ancient, forgotten, calling to me from the depths of darkness. "You're part of the game now," Bosco's voice said, the words slithering through the air like poison. "And the game is nearly over." Suddenly, the book in Kyle's hands burst open with a deafening crack. The pages turned rapidly, the words on them glowing with an eerie, red light. As if pulled by an unseen force, Kyle's body jerked unnaturally, his arms stretching outward, as though he were being torn apart by the ritual itself. A deep, guttural cry escaped his throat, but it wasn't a sound I recognized. I realized with horror that Kyle was no longer just a vessel for Bosco. He had become the portal, the bridge between the living world and the darkness beyond. In that moment, my mind flashed to the one thing that Mr. Fane had told us. The only way to break the pact was through sacrifice. But the thought of losing my brother, I couldn't bear it. But then, a terrifying realization hit me. What if the sacrifice wasn't just Kyle? What if it was me? In a desperate attempt to free us, I grabbed the book from Kyle's hands. The moment my fingers touched it, a surge of power coursed through me, and I could feel every dark secret of my family, every horrible choice, every bit of pain and guilt, all coming together like a crushing weight. I didn't have much time. The darkness was closing in fast. It wanted to consume everything, every shred of light, every bit of hope. But then I heard a voice, low and primal, echoing in my mind. It was Bosco. "You want to stop me? Then sacrifice yourself." And that was the moment the walls came crashing down. The room trembled, and the abyss beneath us grew wider. The air was thick with the scent of decay and death, the very fabric of reality threatening to collapse into nothingness. The shadow of Bosco loomed over us, a vast, writhing entity of nightmare and malice. I realized then that the only way to stop it, to truly break the curse, was not to sacrifice Kyle, but to sacrifice myself. I stepped into the void, my heart pounding in my chest. The book flared to life in my hands, and I began to chant the ancient words, words I didn't know, but that seemed to come to me as if I had always known them. The moment I spoke the final words, the house screamed, the walls cracked, the windows shattered, and a terrifying, deafening roar echoed from the abyss. The shadows clawed at my skin, but I stood firm. Suddenly, everything went black. I awoke in a place that felt wrong. It was as if I were standing on the edge of reality, caught between two worlds. There was no sound, no light, just a deep, empty void stretching endlessly in all directions. And then I heard it, a soft, familiar voice. It was Kyle. "Did you really think you could escape, sis?" he asked, his voice faint but full of dark amusement. I turned around, and there he was, but not the Kyle I remembered. His eyes were dark voids, and his smile stretched unnaturally wide. The shadows around him swirled, and in his hands, he held the book, the same book that had caused all of this. "Bosco never leaves," Kyle whispered, the words dripping with malice. "And now, neither do we." And as I looked around, I realized with horror that I wasn't in the afterlife. I was in the in-between, a prison between worlds. Bosco had consumed our souls, and we were trapped forever in the darkness. The end wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As the story ends, the chilling truth emerges. Bosco didn't just claim their souls, he claimed everyone. The curse, the ritual, the blood debt, it was never meant to end. It was a cycle, a never-ending game. The souls of the family are now bound to the darkness forever, leaving room for new players to be dragged into the nightmare. And somewhere, deep within the shadows, Bosco waits for the next soul to come close enough to claim. The cycle is complete, but as long as the book exists, there is always a chance that the horror will begin again. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.